All right, so today we have Pablo Villalobos. He's a staff researcher at Epoch, uh, I guess a nonprofit research institute based in Europe. And Pablo is in Madrid as we record this podcast. So Epoch describes itself as a team of researchers investigating and forecasting the developments of advanced artificial intelligence. So Pablo, welcome to the Data Exchange podcast.
Thank you, Ben. I'm very glad to be here.
So for our listeners, Paco and the team at Epoch have conducted a series of interesting studies in the year-end report, which we'll go over systematically in this episode. So the first topic I want to talk to you, Paco, about is this paper you folks wrote about this notion that we are running out of data. So and I will link to all the Epoch papers and reports in the episode notes. So make sure you listeners check the episode notes. So first of all, we will run out of data. So what is the origin story behind this paper? So what motivated this paper?
Right. So when we try to develop forecasts for the progress of artificial intelligence or machine learning, the first thing we tried to do was looking at the inputs that go into making machine learning models. And those are compute, data, and algorithms. So yeah, we started by looking at compute, then some properties of algorithms, and finally we were looking at trends in dataset sizes. And around that time, the chinchilla scaling laws came up, and so suddenly people realized that they were using much less data than what's optimal for a given compute level. And we thought that maybe data was going to be more important than we expected. So after finding some past trends in dataset sizes, we decided to try to extrapolate this and just do a first order analysis of how long can this trend continue and what are the physical limits.
So first of all, let's kind of for our listeners define precisely what we mean by so when you try to measure amount of data, I guess it depends on data type. So what are you measuring? Is it uniqueness of the data type, of the data point? So what exactly are you measuring?
Right. So the unit themselves change between the data modalities, as you said. We tried to come up with some universal unit of data, but it was pretty hard. So yeah, we were just measuring, for example, for language models, the number of tokens that they were using, without concerning ourselves too much with things like deduplications, since we mostly trusted the researchers themselves to have done a reasonable job at deduplicating data. So mostly just the number of data points that the model has seen during training.
So this is
so
is it mostly in the context of supervised learning? So in other words, it's a piece of data with a label?
No, we focus on unsupervised learning, mostly self-supervised actually. Just things like language model pre-training or image classification pre-training.
And so one thing someone listening to this episode may say is, now with the rise of generative AI, don't we have unlimited data? Don't we just go to ChatGPT and DALL-E and generate as much data as we want?
That's a great question, actually. And yes, we do have unlimited data, but if you try to train a model on data generated by itself, then you are trying to train it on the distribution that it already has. So yeah, you don't get anywhere. Yeah.
So let's go back to the what you said at the beginning, which is this study was motivated by certain things you saw, certain scaling laws, and these scaling laws suggested that the models that we have right now don't really use that much data. Am I hearing you correctly?
Yeah, well, yeah, previously when when GPT-3 came out and the original scaling loss paper by OpenAI came out, they found that the compute optimal amount of data to parameters in a model was relatively small. You should spend more compute on making a bigger model rather than training it on more data. And instead, Chinchilla corrected that, and Google published a new set of scaling laws that claim that you should roughly increase them at the same rate. If you increase your compute budget, you should spend half of it in a bigger model and half of it in training on more data.
And so let's go through your key findings in this paper. So first for NLP. So what's the key finding for NLP?
So the key finding for NLP is that for general language data, and remember this is unlabeled data for pre-training, if current trends continue as in the past, we will probably run out of data between 2030 and 2050 with a median data around 2040.
And you say, when you say trends, you mean if the language models continue to get as big as they are in recent years, so the trend in increase in model size stays the same, then we will run out of data.
Yes, and this is also taking into account compute limitations. So
right.
It's the current trend with a slight modification for compute limitations.
And so is this finding only for English?
Yes, although I don't expect adding the rest other languages will increase the amount of data by more than a factor of 2 or so. So if you include other languages, it should be more or less similar.
And so the raw data here that you're measuring is what? So what is the corpus of data for NLP that you're measuring?
Yeah, so
is it common crawl or what? What are you measuring?
We took a mixture of several different models because we were not sure exactly what kind of data would be useful or used. If we're talking about generic data, not particularly high quality data, yes, Common Crawl was one of the models, one of the most conservative ones. And then we had a series of increasingly more speculative models where maybe you are considering all the text written by internet users, including things like emails, WhatsApp text, and things like that currently we're not using, but maybe at some point it will be even necessary to use them.
So when you measure, when you measure the amount of data for NLP, at that point you're just literally measuring volume. You don't care about quality. So there's no notion of quality.
Right. Exactly. As I said, we also have a projection for the amount of high quality data, but to be honest, there's not a great definition of high quality data. And yeah.
For language especially, right?
Exactly.
Yeah. All right. So for computer vision, let's I don't know, do we distinguish between images and video in your paper?
Not really. We mostly focus on images, but to be honest, you can turn a video into a series of images. So yeah, we didn't really distinguish much.
So what is the key finding for computer vision?
Well, pretty similar. If without taking into account the compute corrections, the stock for vision will probably last longer because we are using less images than we are using words, because images take more processing to extract data from. But it's also similar. Between 2030 and 2050, with a median year of 2038, we will probably exhaust them also.
Yeah, it seems like the model sizes for computer vision are not as massive as the ones for language, right?
Right. And also, there was a paper on scaling loss for multimodal systems, and they found out that the information that models were able to extract from images was only as much as like 3 or 4 words or something like that. So
it seems like for for a user who's not deep in the space, for a listener who's not deep in the space, okay, so text is one thing, but images seem like more infinite in the sense that there's so many surveillance cameras. People are taking and uploading pictures right and left. So it seems like sensors or cameras on cars and stuff. So there's a lot more images being generated, right?
Right. Well, the ones that are actually being generated, the amount is not that big, I would say. But we could very easily increase that amount by just collecting more and saving more of these images, or even producing more cameras if we want and setting them up everywhere.
So in computer vision, because the model sizes are not growing as fast, that's the reason why this kind of notion of running out of data is further into the future.
Yeah, it's a combination of there being a lot of images, the models not being scaled that much, and the possibility of acquiring more images fairly easily. But yeah.
All right. So, and then the last data type is audio. I don't know if you folks studied audio for speech applications.
Not really, because when we were finding the historical trends, we didn't have enough data points to get a decent trend for audio. So
yeah, there's not as many people working on audio applications. Honestly, I think listeners of this podcast have heard me kind of try to rally people around audio, get people more interested in audio, because I think that's an underexplored area, especially for startups.
Yeah, well, I guess there's a lot of different kinds of audio. If you're talking about speech versus music versus other types, but I think we are seeing lately some decent models for things like music generation. So maybe this is starting to change.
Yeah. And so the premise of the paper is that to some extent, the machine learning research community, the people building models, follow the same path moving forward, right? So in other words, I know at least in NLP, for example, people are starting to talk about efficiency, right? So can we build models that rely on less data, or smaller models, or models that are hybrid that incorporate knowledge graphs or information retrieval and things like this, right? So the paper assumes that basically the path we're on is the path we'll be.
Yeah, it's a very simple analysis in that sense. It doesn't take into account all the possible improvements in data efficiency that you mentioned.
So what has been the reaction to your paper from ML researchers? Of course, now you're going to give me the positive. No, just kidding. Yeah.
Well, actually, I'd say there has been more reaction from the media than from ML researchers themselves.
Okay.
I think if you are a practitioner and you are creating ML models, then you already know more or less to what extent gathering data is a limitation for you in the moment. So, for example, I presented this paper to people at a few companies like Anthropic, and I think they weren't very surprised by the results.
Okay. Yeah. And so Anthropic focuses mostly on language, right?
Yes. Yes.
And so in your paper, the most pressing problem is in language.
Yes, I would say so, particularly if we're assuming that we'll only use very high quality data. Yeah.
Let's see. So you wrote another blog post more broadly on scaling, right? Trends in scaling loss. And
I recently wrote a short review on the literature of scaling loss. Yes.
Yeah. So in this, obviously one of the aspects in scaling loss is probably the amount of data, right? So what about the other aspects like compute? So what are some of your key findings there?
Yeah. So
So first of all, Pablo, actually, for our listeners who don't follow this stuff, can you kind of briefly define or describe what is meant by scaling laws?
Yeah. So scaling laws are predictable relationships between the scale property of models, like how many parameters the model has, how much compute they used in training, and how many data they consumed, and their performance after training or other properties of interest.
So accuracy might be one of them, right? So
Yeah, or even there are scaling laws for how much a model over optimizes a metric with respect to the true thing that you care about. So
basically, generally, think of scaling losses on the horizontal axis. Something is growing, and then
Mhm.
on the vertical axis, maybe some metric or measuring the model is being measured, right? So
yeah, exactly.
yeah.
And the key thing is that these tend to be predictable, so you can run experiments on small scale models and then design your larger scale training runs to be as cheap as possible for the amount of
So you
data you
can
have.
one can imagine building like even like a regression model. That would be your scaling law, right? So
Yeah, exactly.
yeah. So then okay, so you looked at scaling laws for various areas. So we talked about data. Oh, so by the way, let's go over data. So for data, as you said earlier, the more data you have, the better your model is. It's generally true.
Right. Yeah, in general, when you are measuring the accuracy or the loss on whatever task you're training on, this is straightforwardly true, and it usually obeys a power law. So at the beginning, data is most useful, but then you hit diminishing returns.
Right.
But for when you are doing transfer learning to other tasks, then the relationship becomes a bit more blurry, and sometimes the model doesn't improve at all for a long time, and then suddenly it becomes very capable. And people often refer to this as emergence or things like that, where the model suddenly learns to do something after a given amount of data or amount of parameters.
So generally speaking, so what did you find around scaling laws for data in compute?
For data and compute, well, the basic finding is, as I mentioned, that the performance or accuracy follows a power law, which means, yeah, that at some points you hit diminishing returns and you approach an asymptotic performance when you have infinite data or infinite compute. But
This kind of is good news for the previous paper because at some point then you don't need additional data.
well, I would actually say it's bad news, because if you want the same improvement that you had from in a given year, then you need to increase the amount of data even more the next year.
No, I thought you said so there's diminishing returns. You have like this flattening of improvement, right?
Right. So yeah, so if you want to keep the same rate of improvement over time, you
I
need
see.
to.
So this is like actually we're measuring the derivative in some ways.
Right.
Yeah. Oh yeah, so that's bad news. So so uh so the idea here, so the goal for studying scaling laws generally is what?
Well, for ML researchers, it's just to better predict and better design machine learning models. For us, for Epoch, is having a way to predict, okay, if in 10 years from now, we'll have this amount of compute and this amount of data, where will ML models be? What will they be able to do? And current scaling laws are not quite there yet, because there's still plenty of uncertainty, and they change a lot. They've changed a lot during the past couple of years, but that's the ultimate goal for us.
Okay, so then what is the state of the art in terms of understanding?
Well, empirically, they seem to work very well for whatever task that you choose, and even for similar collections of tasks, you can empirically fit a scaling law, and it usually is very predictive of bigger models. But we don't quite understand theoretically why they are what they are, what governs the scaling exponents, which tell you exactly to what extent there's diminishing returns. So it's hard to tell whether this empirical phenomenon is very concrete to our current architectures, or whether it will generalize if 5 years from now we discover something even better than the transformer or something like that. We don't know if the current scaling laws will still apply or not.
Yeah, something more efficient, right?
Right.
Right. Because to some extent, the models we use right now are quite inefficient in the sense that, for example, humans don't need as many examples to detect patterns, but these models seem to require so many examples, right?
Yeah, definitely. And there's some evidence that the generic power law form of the scaling laws is probably close to universal, but we are far from the what is thought to be the optimal efficiency. So yeah.
So we began by talking about this notion that we might be running out of data, but it seems like a more pressing problem is we might be running out of compute, right?
Yeah, I mean, definitely the biggest bottleneck right now is that compute costs money and
greenhouse emissions.
Yeah, of course, yes.
Yeah. And so what are some general trends around compute that you want to highlight for our listeners?
Well, probably the most important, there's two important trends. One is Moore's law, of course, that makes compute more efficient and cheaper. But as probably everyone has heard, Moore's law is supposed to be ending soon.
That's what they've been saying.
Yeah. We tried looking at this at Epoch, and yeah, it does look like Moore's law might stop in the next decade or so. But there are also a lot of alternative compute paradigms like optical computing, quantum computing, neuromorphic computing that might take us from there. So who knows? So yeah, that's one important trend.
There's also so Moore's law in many ways is focused on flops, but there's also memory, right? So memory bandwidth, interconnects. Because at some point these models get so big that you really need to do distributed computing, and so a lot of these things matter, right? So you're not going to be able to fit these models unless you scale out in memory, right? So
yeah.
So do you guys I guess this is my long-winded question of do you also track trends in memory?
We are working on that, but it's not done yet. But yeah, I would say it's fairly likely that we will see more compute architectures that use processing in memory and things like that, which bring memory closer to the actual computation and try to alleviate this interconnect, like this bandwidth bottlenecks for memory. But yeah, there's definitely a lot of dimensions of compute.
Right.
Flops.
And of course, compute now is a sensitive topic with the export controls to China, right? So who knows how that's going to play out, because China's traditionally been a very important peg in the AI progress in AI, right? So in recent years, at least, right? So
right. Yeah. Unfortunately, these geopolitics and economic sanctions are way out of my expertise. But yeah. Who knows what will happen there?
So model size trends. I mean, I guess we just keep getting bigger. Is that what is that the prediction generally of Epoch? I guess depends on the data type, right?
Sorry, I forgot the other important trend for
okay.
compute,
Okay.
which is algorithmic improvement. And basically, algorithmic improvement has been halving the compute requirements to reach a certain accuracy. For example, for vision, it has been halving them by, I think, every half a year or something like that. So even if Moore's law stops completely just by getting more efficient algorithms, we might probably still scale.
But that's only for vision. What about language?
For language, it's a bit more blurry. We're also about to release a paper on that, and I don't remember the exact results, but I think it was a bit worse.
Right. So, by the way, so Pablo, I go back to my pet peeve, which is every time we talk about these things, we ignore audio.
Yeah.
Right. So there's not as much because there's not as many data points for audio, I think, right? So there's not as many groups working on it, you know, because in language and in computer vision and to some extent the multimodality between the two, there's a lot of excitement, right? So there's a lot of people working on it.
Yeah. I don't know why for audio I don't know why people aren't focusing more on audio. I wonder if it has to do with it being harder to gather.
It's harder to work with. The data is harder to work with. All right. So trends in model size. So we just keep getting bigger.
It did seem that we were going to keep getting bigger, but with the new chinchilla scaling laws, it seems that returns to increasing size are currently lower than returns to increasing data. So sometimes you see when people are speculating about GPT-4 that it will have 100 trillion parameters or something like that. And I think that's way too big. I would be surprised if it's more than 1 trillion parameters or maybe.
So that means every time you ask it a question, it's $20 of inference worth of inference.
Yeah.
right now it's cents, right? So when you interact with it, and then as you mentioned earlier, what you folks found is that actually some of these models don't use as much data. Right.
Yeah, for example, GPT-3 was trained on like 300 billion tokens, and Chinchilla was trained on more than 4 times as much, I think, while being almost half as big in terms of parameters. And I think they reached the same or even better performance. So
by the way, I forgot to ask you a question about the when we're the first topic, which is the notion that we're running out of data. I'd be remiss not to ask you about synthetic data. So what's the role of synthetic data?
Yeah, to be honest, right now I think it's the most likely way that that researchers will sidestep this data bottleneck and just continue scaling.
But isn't synthetic data, Pablo, kind of similar to the generative AI in the sense that you're basically generating data for a distribution you already have seen? I guess you can tweak the distribution a little bit, but
exactly, yeah. In general, it is. But if you have some sort of filtering or amplification step where you take only the best data, for example, if you're writing programs, you can keep only programs that are syntactically correct or something, and then train on that, then you can improve. And we've already seen this with things like AlphaZero, which trained on synthetic data, self-generated by playing against itself.
Right.
So I think it's pretty likely that you can have some sort of synthetic data training loop, which gives significant improvement.
And so then the idea there is probably maybe people start generating synthetic data and release it out to the open domain so that other people can use it for training. Kind of like a common crawl for synthetic data.
That would be nice, certainly, but I guess there's also the possibility that companies will keep the data for themselves and keep it closed access.
Yeah. And so then of all these trends, what concerns you the most?
What concerns me the most? Well, in terms of the likelihood of slowing down
Let's say
AI
let's say
progress,
5 to 10 years, what worries you the most?
mm,
In terms of, by worry, I mean that will halt progress.
yeah. So in the very short term, I am a bit worried about data, especially if we're only using high quality data, and it turns out you can't trade off quality for quantity. But yeah, as I said before, I expect that to be more or less solved. So
And
I
again,
would say
how do we solve that particular problem?
by things like multimodality, synthetic data, and other techniques for increased data efficiency, probably. But yeah, beyond that, I would say that I expect compute to be the biggest bottleneck, because it seems way harder to cheat the laws of physics and semiconductors.
If you don't have enough compute, you don't have enough compute. So to some extent, don't you think that a lot of what you do should be a call to arms to ML researchers to maybe we need different ideas? Because if everyone is just going through the same path, then we will have problems down the road.
Well, it's hard to tell. I can see a world in which more or less similar architectures than what we use today end up sort of circumventing these problems. But yeah, I would definitely like more research into different paradigms and or different architectures, and trying to be more efficient in general. Yeah.
So obviously, reinforcement learning is not an answer to any of these things either, because that's very computationally inefficient, right?
Yeah, I would say so. I actually haven't looked into how inefficient reinforcement learning is compared to unsupervised learning, but right now it doesn't seem to be a viable alternative at all.
So are there any specific trends on the algorithm side that gives you hope?
Well, yeah, there in the Chinchilla paper.
You had a big pregnant there, huh? All right, so go ahead.
Yeah, things like retrieval mechanisms, for example. I think in the Chinchilla paper they mentioned that they increase data efficiency, and also they are
and then the model doesn't have. So by the way, so for retrieval based, one thing that we should put out there is you still have to have a decent model, but you can get by with probably smaller models, right?
Right. Yeah. And for saving compute, you could also try sparsity. There's a lot of stuff going on there which I don't really know much about, but it seems like an exciting research direction.
And then in terms of investment in general, you think that all of these areas are well invested in terms of people are trying to explore ways to overcome bottlenecks in data compute and models?
Great question. I'm not sure. When it comes to trying modifications to existing architectures, yeah, I think there's lots of people doing that. When it comes to trying something very different or mixing different types of paradigms, I'm not that knowledgeable about that, but my impression is that there's not that many people doing that.
So in terms of people who are listening to this episode who want to figure out, who want to help in any of these areas, obviously the hardest place to help is compute, because you have to be in the hardware space. You have to be a hardware engineer to help there. modeling, maybe over time you develop the skills, but maybe the easiest place for people to help is in data. So, what are some things that people can do around data? That I guess synthetic data. What else can someone who wants to advance AI progress do to overcome some of these bottlenecks?
For specific tasks, there's probably still a lot of low-hanging fruit in just making better data sets and benchmarks. Like,
all the time,
Yeah.
right? So for example, the Lion,
Right.
I have friends who have a tool called FastDupe, a free tool, and they found a lot of duplicates and mislabeled images on Lion. So there's a lot of work that can be done to even improve existing data sets, right?
Yeah. And even what was considered a very high quality data set a few years ago, like the pile, then somebody else looks at it and figures out that there's a lot of ways to improve it. So yeah, definitely.
Yeah, and generally, so in the case of transfer learning, you had mentioned earlier that there's certain kind of scaling laws that don't work as well in transfer learning. So can you just generally give us the lay of the land in terms of transfer learning? I mean, without, I guess it's hard to say exactly if there's a singular thing you can say, but just generally give us a feel for what's happening in transfer learning.
So, well, transfer learning in general is, I'd say, very popular right now. All the foundation models are working great. When you are transferring between two tasks that are kind of similar, like writing language, natural language versus writing Python code, then there's somewhat predictable scaling laws for transfer, and you can exploit them. The problem and the unpredictabilities come when you are transferring between tasks that are not that similar, or that have very weird and very idiosyncratic performance measures. Like, I don't know, if you're trying to get the model to exactly output some answers to some questions, then this is a very fragile performance metric, and so the scaling laws for transfer learning there don't work very well. So
yeah, interesting. So one thing that is just starting to happen now, Pablo, is we talk about having access to data and having access to data in the internet and so on and so forth. But now with the rise of generative AI, I think intellectual property and to some extent maybe later on privacy will become obstacles, right? So there's going to be like barriers to just using whatever data you come across.
Yeah, and an example of this that I saw recently was the Galactica model by Meta that was trained on a lot of scientific text. They said they used like 48 million papers or scientific text, but of those 48 million, only 8 million were the full papers. The other 40 million were abstracts because they didn't have access to the scientific databases to get the whole text of the paper. So this access to data, and of course the thornier issue is with things like art and
or for example, more recently, Getty Images, right?
Yeah. So yeah, I'm not sure how to even solve this because it's probably infeasible to just have everyone pay.
I'm personally a very content and happy user of GitHub Copilot, but GitHub might also have problems. I mean, GitHub Copilot may also have problems accessing all those repos, right?
Yes, exactly. And there are lawsuits against it. So yeah, I'm also a very happy user of Copilot, and I certainly hope that this doesn't become a really big obstacle for AI, but we'll see, I guess.
And then there's also, Pablo, the notion of, okay, so let's say there's a foundation model out there that I'm happy as a user for fun, but when I start when I look at this foundation model in the context of a company, then things change because basically, am I comfortable sending my data to an API, on a service that may be using my data to improve itself, right? Uh, so there will be lots of reasons why people may end up, I guess, training their own version of these foundation models in-house if they're a company. And so in which case, those public foundation models that we think have access to unlimited data will not actually have access to unlimited data because people will not be comfortable using them, right?
Mm,
I mean, imagine if you're like some big bank in Spain and you want to use some public foundation model, maybe or healthcare company, right? So maybe you don't do that, right? So maybe you take a public open source foundation model and bring that in-house and try to improve that in-house rather than sending your data through some public API, and so on.
yeah,
Yeah.
yeah, I guess that's a possibility. If I mean, I do think we'll definitely see a
So
lot
do you
of
think that
open source.
over time, for example, employers will probably be wary about what their employees are typing into an application like ChatGPT? Because what if that's trade secrets, right? So can you rewrite this paragraph for me so that I can send an email internally? But no, you can't do that, right? So
Yeah. I actually do think that's fairly likely.
yeah.
You
So
know,
then those models that we think will be used and learn from all sorts of people may not actually end up that way, right? So
yeah. Well, that might even be a good thing if it
yeah.
encourages more competition and less
Yeah, and also
concentration.
I think that also will drive a little more focus into helping some of these open source projects because then people can take these open source artifacts and build their own, right? Internally,
Yeah.
that's more secure. So there'll be more focus on some of these open source data sets, open source starter models, and then bring them in-house. By the way, so one last question. So I don't know if this is something you looked at, but some of these models you can put things in the training data and kind of put back doors, right?
Yeah.
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 So at some point, when people get desperate for data, maybe they lower their guard for what kind of data they're using to train these models. So we also have to keep that in mind, right?
Yeah. I don't know if there's any way of guarding about this right now.
Yeah. No. Well, especially since one of the first topic we talked about is the fact that people might get desperate for data. So
Yeah.
they won't have too many quality control checks. They just, okay, you want to give me data? I'll take your data, right? So
Yeah. It's definitely worrisome.
yeah. And on that optimistic note, thank you, Pablo. This has been great. And great to tell our listeners about the work of Epoch as well.
Well, thank you, Ben, for inviting me, and it's been a pleasure to talk to you.